The cry began not as a sound, but as a fracture in the perfect, sterile silence of the house. It started low, a thin, desolate wail that seeped from the nursery and spread through the cavernous, glass-walled mansion like a poison. By midnight, it had escalated into a full-blown storm of infant grief. A raw, relentless scream that bounced off the cold marble floors and minimalist furniture, echoing the hollow ache in Julian Croft's own chest. He stood in the doorway of the nursery, a ghost in his own home. He was a titan of the tech world, a man whose code could predict market fluctuations with unnerving accuracy. Yet, he was utterly powerless against the sorrow of his 6-month-old daughter, Luna. He watched as the night nurse, a woman with impeccable credentials and a salary that could fund a small startup, tried everything the textbooks recommended. Rocking, swaddling, a bottle of warm milk, all were met with the same escalating shrieks of distress. "She just won't settle. Mr. Croft," the nurse said, her professional calm fraying at the edges. "It's likely just colic. We simply have to wait it out." But Julian knew it wasn't colic. It was a sound he understood on a primal level. It was the sound of pure, untempered loss. As the nurse finally retreated in defeat, another figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway. It was Isla May, the maid, the woman hired to erase smudges from glass and dust from surfaces, to remain as unseen as the air itself. She paused at the doorway, her presence so quiet Julian barely registered her at first. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the tiny, red-faced infant thrashing in the state-of-the-art crib. Without a word, she glided into the room. She didn't move toward the crib. Instead, she went to the large picture window, which overlooked the roaring Pacific Ocean, and drew the heavy blackout curtains, plunging the room into a deep, comforting darkness. She then turned off the overhead light, leaving only the soft, amber glow of a small salt lamp in the corner. Then, she began to hum, a low, steady sound, almost like the white noise of a fan. She approached the crib and simply stood there, her quiet presence a stark contrast to the nurse's frantic energy. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the baby's cries began to soften. The sharp, panicked peaks of her screams rounded into shuddering sobs. Isla still didn't touch her. She just continued her soft, rhythmic shushing. A human sound machine against the vast, terrifying silence. Within minutes, the sobs subsided into whimpers, and the whimpers faded into the quiet. Even breaths of sleep. Julian stood frozen in the doorway, a spectator to a miracle he couldn't comprehend. The specialists, the doctors, the high-priced help they had all failed, and this woman, this silent, invisible employee, had calmed the storm with nothing more than darkness and a sound. He watched as she finally reached a hand through the crib bars, her fingers gently resting on Luna's back, a silent promise of presence. He didn't understand what he had just witnessed, but he knew it was something profound, something that defied the logic and data that had governed his entire life. Julian Croft's mansion in Carmel was less a home and more a monument to a life that no longer existed. perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific. Its walls of glass and stark white concrete were designed to frame the beauty of the outside world. Yet they served only to amplify the emptiness within. Every surface was immaculate, every piece of furniture a minimalist masterpiece chosen by Evelyn, his late wife. The house was a museum of her impeccable taste, and Julian was its lonely, haunted curator. He had built his empire, Croft Dynamics, on the principle of elegant, logical solutions to complex problems. His algorithms could streamline global supply chains, optimize energy grids, and predict consumer behavior with terrifying precision. He was a man who believed that any problem, no matter how vast, could be broken down into data points, analyzed, and solved. Then, 6 months ago, a winding coastal highway and a patch of black ice had presented him with a problem for which there was no algorithm: the sudden, violent loss of his wife. Now, he lived in the wreckage. Grief was an illogical, chaotic force, and he met it with the only tool he knew: avoidance. He worked relentlessly, taking meetings at all hours, losing himself in the clean, predictable world of code and quarterly reports. The mansion, once a haven of shared laughter and quiet moments, became a place he only slept. And then there was Luna, his daughter. The last living piece of Evelyn was a constant, wailing reminder of his failure. He loved her with a desperate, aching intensity, but he was terrified of her. Her cries were not the sounds of a baby needing to be fed or changed. To his ears, they were accusations. They accused him of not being there, of not being enough, of not being her. He couldn't soothe Luna because he couldn't soothe himself. So he did what powerful men do: he outsourced the problem. He hired the best pediatric nurses, the most sought-after nannies, a team of professionals who came with glowing recommendations and exorbitant price tags. They managed Luna's schedule with the efficiency of a corporate merger, ensuring she was fed, bathed, and monitored. They turned the act of parenting into a series of tasks to be completed, a checklist of duties that kept Julian at a safe, sterile distance. He would receive daily reports via email, concise summaries of Luna's sleep patterns and feeding times, reducing his daughter to a set of manageable data points. He told himself it was what was best for her, that his raw, clumsy grief was a danger to her fragile world. But deep down, in the silent hours of the night when her cries echoed through the empty halls, he knew he was simply a coward, hiding from the one connection that mattered most. The house was his fortress, but it was also his prison, and the wails of his own daughter were the sound of the key turning in the lock. Isla May understood the geography of grief. She knew how it could hollow out a house, leaving behind beautiful, empty rooms and a silence that was louder than any noise. She had navigated such landscapes her entire life, from one foster home to another, learning early on that the best way to survive was to become a part of the scenery. She was an expert in the art of invisibility. Her work at the Croft estate was a study in quiet precision. She moved through the vast, sun-drenched rooms with a methodical calm, her presence as unobtrusive as a passing breeze. She cleaned with a focus that bordered on meditative, her hands restoring order to a world consumed by chaos. The other staff, a rotating cast of agency-supplied professionals, saw her as just the maid, efficient, silent and unremarkable. They never saw her watching, but Isla saw everything. She noticed things that the high-paid specialists, with their clipboards and rigid schedules, missed. She saw that Luna's most frantic crying fits weren't random. They were triggered. They happened when the automatic blinds in the living room opened too quickly, flooding the space with harsh morning light. They happened when the sterling silver cutlery clattered loudly during meal service. They happened when a visitor with a sharp, high-pitched laugh entered the room. To everyone else, Luna was a fussy baby, still traumatized by the loss of her mother. To Isla, Luna was a child speaking a language no one else was bothering to learn. Her own past was a patchwork of similar silences, of needs that went unseen and unheard. She remembered a boy in one of her foster homes, a quiet, withdrawn child named Sam, who would rock back and forth for hours. The foster parents called him difficult. Isla, only 10 herself, was the one who noticed he only rocked when the television was on. She started taking him outside to sit under a large oak tree whenever the TV was blaring, and the rocking would stop. She didn't have a name for it then, but she understood the concept. Some people just felt the world too intensely. This intuition was her secret, a quiet wisdom cultivated through a lifetime of observation. Tucked away in a worn canvas bag in her locker was not a smartphone or a magazine, but an old dog-eared textbook she'd found at a thrift store years ago, The Out-of-Sync Child. Its pages were filled with her own handwritten notes, observations connecting the clinical descriptions to the real, lived experiences she had witnessed. She wasn't a doctor or a therapist, but she was a student of the human condition, taught by the most demanding professor of all survival. And as she watched baby Luna, she recognized a familiar story, a silent plea for a world that was a little softer, a little quieter, a little less overwhelming. The fragile peace that had settled over the house was shattered by the arrival of Beatrice Croft. Julian's older sister descended upon the Carmel mansion not like a visitor, but like an occupying force, her expensive heels clicking on the marble with the sharp, imperious rhythm of a metronome set to a frantic tempo. She swept into the living room, a whirlwind of designer perfume and barely concealed disapproval, her eyes scanning the space for flaws. "Julian, darling," she announced, her voice a theatrical sigh as she air-kissed his cheek. "You look dreadful, absolutely dreadful. And this house, it feels like a mausoleum." Julian, who had been attempting to review a financial report, simply closed his eyes. Beatrice was a force of nature he had never learned to withstand. She saw his grief not as a wound to be tended, but as a weakness to be managed. "I'm managing." "Beatrice," he said, his voice flat. "Are you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're drowning," she countered, her gaze landing on a stray baby toy on the floor. She nudged it with the toe of her pointed heel. "And you're letting this chaos take over. I've told you, you need a proper household manager, a governess, someone who can impose some order, not just this rotating cast of agency help." As if on cue, Luna, who had been quietly sleeping in her bassinet in the adjoining sunroom, began to stir. Beatrice's sharp, loud voice had sliced through her peaceful slumber. A small whimper was followed by the familiar, escalating cry of distress. Isla, who had been polishing a silver frame in the dining room, moved instinctively toward the sound. But Beatrice blocked her path with a raised hand, her eyes dismissing Isla as if she were a piece of furniture. She turned to Julian, her voice laced with an "I told you so" tone. "You see, this is what I'm talking about. The child is a nervous wreck. You're not equipped for this, Julian." She then glanced toward Isla, her expression turning from condescension to outright command. "Well, don't just stand there. Do something. Isn't that what you're paid for?" The words were a slap, a cold, calculated assertion of hierarchy. Isla felt the sting, the familiar burn of being reduced to her function, her humanity erased. Julian, trapped between his sister's overbearing presence and his own exhaustion, simply capitulated. He was too tired to fight, too broken to defend anyone, least of all the silent woman who worked in his house. He gave a weary, almost imperceptible nod in Isla's direction, a gesture that said, "Just handle it." His silence was a betrayal. It was a quiet, cowardly surrender that left Isla standing alone, exposed to Beatrice's scorn. In that moment, he wasn't just a grieving widower, he was a complicit participant in her humiliation. Isla looked from Julian's averted gaze to Beatrice's smug, triumphant one. She said nothing. With a quiet dignity that was a rebellion in itself, she simply nodded, turned, and walked into the sunroom to tend to the crying child, leaving the two wealthy siblings alone in the cold, echoing silence of their own making. That night, the storm inside the mansion raged with a renewed fury. Beatrice's visit had left a toxic residue in the air, agitating a house that was already on edge. Luna's cries were the most frantic they had been in weeks, a piercing, inconsolable symphony of distress that no amount of professional care could quell. The night nurse, flustered and defeated, finally knocked on Julian's study door just after 2 a.m. "Mr. Croft, I'm sorry, but nothing is working," she admitted, her voice strained. "I've checked everything. She's fed. She's dry. She has no fever. I think she just needs her father." It was the one thing he feared most. He walked down the darkened hallway to the nursery, the screams growing louder, each one a fresh stab of guilt. He entered to find the nurse wringing her hands, the baby in the crib thrashing, her tiny body rigid with a sorrow he couldn't comprehend. He tried. He picked her up, his arms feeling clumsy and foreign. He rocked her, whispered to her, but his touch seemed only to make it worse. The baby arched her back, screaming directly into his face, her cries a raw accusation. He was about to give up, to retreat back to the safety of his study, when a movement in the corner of his eye caught his attention. It was Isla. He hadn't even heard her enter. She had a basket of folded laundry in her arms and was simply standing there, watching. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a deep, knowing sadness. In a moment of sheer, unadulterated desperation, he did something he never thought he would. He looked at her, his voice cracking. "Help me." Isla put the basket down. She approached, not with the brisk efficiency of the nurse, but with a palpable aura of calm. She didn't reach for the baby. Instead, she spoke to him. "Sir, your heart is beating too fast. She can feel it." She guided him to the rocking chair. "Sit. Hold her against your chest. Close your eyes and just breathe." Let her hear your heart slow down." He did as she said, feeling foolish, but with no other options. Isla then moved through the room, recreating the same environment from that first night. She dimmed the lights, drew the curtains, and began her soft, rhythmic shushing. As Julian sat there, holding his screaming daughter, he focused on the sound of Isla's voice, on the slow, steady rhythm of his own breathing. And gradually, a miracle happened. Luna's frantic screams softened to sobs, her rigid body relaxed against his chest, and her tiny, grasping hands unclenched. Her breathing began to sync with his, and within 10 minutes, she was asleep, a tear still glistening on her cheek. Isla helped him lay the sleeping baby back in the crib. The silence that filled the room was profound, a sacred peace after a long and brutal war. He stood to leave, exhausted, but for the first time, not entirely defeated. But it was what he saw as he walked past the nursery hours later, on his way to his own bed, that truly shattered his world. The door was slightly ajar. He peeked inside. The nurse was gone, her shift over. The room was dark and quiet. But there, on the soft sheepskin rug next to the crib, was a shape. It was Isla, curled up on the floor, fast asleep. She had taken a thin blanket from the linen closet and made a pallet for herself. One of her arms was stretched out, her hand resting near the base of the crib, a silent, unconscious gesture of protection. Julian stood there, frozen, his mind struggling to process the scene. This woman, whom his sister had treated like dirt, whom he had allowed to be humiliated, had not just done her job. She had stayed. She had chosen to sleep on the hard floor, not for money, not for praise, but simply to be near a child in distress, to offer a comforting presence in the dark. The sheer, uncalculated humanity of the act struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was an act of profound, selfless empathy that his wealth could not buy, his logic could not explain, and his own conduct could not justify. He looked at the sleeping woman on the floor, and then at his peaceful, sleeping daughter, and a question, sharp and painful, lodged itself in his heart. Who was the real caregiver in this house, and who was the real failure? At that moment, the billionaire realized the woman sleeping on his floor might hold the answer to a problem he didn't even know he had. If you believe that the greatest strength is found in the quietest acts of kindness, give us a like to show your support for Isla, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The image of Isla sleeping on the nursery floor haunted Julian through the restless hours of the morning. It was a silent, powerful indictment of his own detachment. When the sun finally rose, casting a pale, clinical light over his sterile home, he did not retreat to his office as usual. Instead, he walked to the central control panel in the living room and, with a few taps on the screen, brought up the personnel files for the household staff. He bypassed the night nurse and the housekeeper, his finger hovering over the icon labeled Isla May. He clicked it. The file that opened was sparse, provided by the high-end domestic staffing agency he used. It listed her basic information: a clean background check, and a brief, generic work history, extensive experience in domestic settings. There was no mention of her qualifications, no hint of the quiet expertise he had witnessed. It was the resume of a ghost, designed to be efficient and forgettable. Frustrated, he scrolled to the bottom of the file and found what he was looking for, the original application she had submitted to the agency. Tucked away, unlinked from her primary profile, was a scanned copy of a certificate. Certificate of completion. Specialized care for children with sensory and neurological disorders. Julian leaned closer to the screen. It was from a small, community-based training program, not a prestigious university, but it was concrete. It was proof. He then did something he hadn't done in years. He picked up the phone and called the agency director himself. "This is Julian Croft," he said, cutting through the receptionist's pleasantries. "I'm calling about an employee, Isla May. I want her full, unedited file. Now." The director, flustered by the unexpected call from a billionaire client, complied immediately. The file that arrived in Julian's inbox moments later was substantially different. It included references from previous employers' short-term nanny positions, mostly. But it was the notes from the references that caught his eye. "Isla has an almost supernatural calm with our son, who has non-verbal autism. She was the only one who could get our daughter, who suffers from severe anxiety, to sleep through the night. She doesn't just manage behavior, she seems to understand the root of it." The staffing agency, in its effort to present a clean and simple profile for a domestic helper, had stripped away the very details that made her exceptional. They had categorized her expertise as a mere personality trait, her specialized skill as a simple affinity for difficult children. Armed with this new information, Julian began to observe Isla not as an employee, but as an expert. He spent the day in the house, a rare occurrence, pretending to work from the living room, from his vantage point. He watched her every interaction with Luna. He saw the deliberate, almost imperceptible way she moved. When Luna was awake, Isla never made sudden noises. She would announce her presence in a room with a soft hum before she even entered. She changed Luna's clothes not with brisk efficiency, but with slow, gentle pressure, applying a firm but comforting touch that seemed to ground the infant. She had replaced the brightly colored, noisy plastic toys in the nursery with soft, textured blankets, wooden blocks, and objects that engaged the sense of touch rather than sound. Every action was intentional. Every choice was informed. This wasn't just intuition. It was a methodology. He was watching a master at work, a specialist whose diagnostic tools were not machines and charts, but empathy and profound, microscopic observation. And he, with all his wealth and resources, had been utterly blind to it. The seed of doubt planted in the dark of the nursery began to sprout, its roots pushing through the hard, compacted soil of his own arrogance and grief. Later that afternoon, Julian found Isla in the sunroom, gently rocking a now calm Luna in her arms. The infant was staring, mesmerized, at the slow, silent dance of dust motes in a beam of afternoon light. He entered the room quietly, his presence no longer that of a boss, but of a student approaching a teacher. "May I ask you a question?" "Isla," he said, his voice stripped of its usual command. Isla looked up, her expression calm, but her eyes were cautious. "Of course, sir. That certificate," he began, "the one for specialized childcare. Why isn't that the first line on your resume? Why are you cleaning houses when you have that kind of expertise?" Isla shifted her gaze from him back to the baby, her rocking never breaking its gentle rhythm. "Because a piece of paper doesn't pay the rent, Mr. Croft. And because people in your world, they value degrees from Harvard, not certificates from community outreach programs in the Bronx." The story came out then, not as a complaint, but as a simple statement of fact. She told him about her life, a childhood spent moving through the fractured, often brutal, world of the foster care system. She was the quiet observer, the one who learned to read the unspoken needs of the other children who were, like her, lost and hurting. "No one ever taught me," she explained, her voice a soft murmur. "I just learned. I learned that some kids couldn't stand the scratchy wool blankets in the winter. I learned that the hum of the old refrigerator could soothe a baby who was terrified of silence. I learned that a firm, steady hand on the back was more comforting than a light, ticklish touch. I didn't have the words for it then, but I understood that for some of us, the world just feels louder, brighter, sharper." She told him about taking the certification course, paid for with years of saved tips from waitressing jobs, hoping it would be a bridge to a real career. But the bridge led nowhere. The jobs she was qualified for on paper were given to candidates with more traditional backgrounds. The world saw her past, her lack of a prestigious degree, and dismissed her. So she took the work she could get, the work that made her invisible again. "You're not invisible to her," Julian said quietly, nodding toward Luna, who was now fast asleep on Isla's shoulder. "No," Isla agreed, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "Babies don't read resumes. They read hearts. They feel who is safe and who is not." Her words were simple, yet they held a profound truth that resonated deep within Julian. He had surrounded his daughter with the best that money could buy, but he had failed to give her the one thing she truly needed, a sense of safety. And this woman, who had nothing, had given it to her freely, intuitively. "What is it you see when you look at her?" Julian asked. The question raw with a vulnerability he hadn't shown to anyone since Evelyn died. "What do you know that the rest of us don't?" Isla looked at him then, her gaze direct and unflinching. "I see a little girl who is feeling the world without a filter. The light is too bright, the sounds are too loud. The touch of a certain fabric feels like sandpaper. She isn't being difficult, Mr. Croft. She's just overwhelmed. And she's trying to tell you that in the only language she knows." Her words weren't a diagnosis, but they were a key that unlocked a door in Julian's mind, revealing a path forward that was both terrifying and full of a strange, unfamiliar hope. Isla's words, "feeling the world without a filter," echoed in Julian's mind long after she had left the room. It was a phrase so simple, yet it reframed everything. He had been viewing Luna's crying as a symptom of sadness, a problem to be solved. He had never considered that it might be a reaction to her environment, a desperate response to sensory overload. That night, Julian did not go to his study to lose himself in work. Instead, he sat at his laptop in the silent kitchen, the glow of the screen illuminating his face in the darkness. He typed Isla's words into the search bar, "Baby feels world without a filter." The first result that appeared was an article from a pediatric neurology journal. The title was clinical and academic, but the abstract contained a phrase that made him sit bolt upright: sensory processing disorder, SPD. He clicked the link, and for the next 3 hours, he fell down a rabbit hole of research, a world of scientific literature, parent forums, and therapeutic blogs that described his daughter with a startling, almost unnerving accuracy. He read about the different types of sensory sensitivities: tactile defensiveness, where the touch of certain fabrics can feel painful; auditory hypersensitivity, where everyday sounds like a doorbell or a blender can be perceived as threateningly loud; visual overstimulation, where bright lights or busy patterns can overwhelm the nervous system. He read the testimonials of parents, their words a heartbreaking chorus of the very struggles he had witnessed in his own home. "My son would scream every time we put him in his car seat." We later realized the texture of the fabric was the problem. Meal times were a nightmare until we discovered she couldn't handle the smell of different foods on the same plate. Everyone told me he was just a colicky baby, but I knew it was more. It was like he was in a constant state of fight or flight. Every word was a revelation. Every symptom described was a piece of Luna's puzzle falling into place. Her screaming fits when the blinds were opened, her calming down to the low, steady hum of a vacuum cleaner, her aversion to certain textured blankets, her instant, panicked reaction to his sister Beatrice's loud, sharp voice. It wasn't grief, it wasn't colic, it was a neurological condition. The trap that had ensnared his family wasn't a malicious plot, it was a trap of ignorance. It was the collective failure of a team of highly paid medical professionals who had seen a crying baby and defaulted to the most common, and in this case, incorrect diagnosis. They had looked, but they hadn't seen. They had listened, but they hadn't heard. They had followed their protocols and missed the truth that was screaming right in front of them. And Ela, with no medical degree, no fancy credentials, had seen it. She had seen it because she wasn't looking for a diagnosis in a textbook. She was reading the language of the child herself. A wave of cold fury washed over Julian. Fury at the doctors, at the nurses, but most of all at himself. He had the resources, the power, the access to the best medical minds in the world, and yet he had been completely, utterly blind. He had been so lost in the fog of his own grief that he had failed to see that his daughter was lost in a fog of her own, a fog of overwhelming sensory input. He picked up his phone, his fingers moving with a new, decisive purpose. He didn't call the head of the nursing agency to fire them. He called the top pediatric sensory specialist on the West Coast, a woman whose work he had just read about, and left a message that was both a plea and a command. "Dr. Aris," he said, "my name is Julian Croft. I need your help. I think I finally understand what's wrong with my daughter." Julian's newfound clarity was a powerful, driving force. He spent the next day preparing for the specialist's visit, transforming from a passive, grieving father into an active, determined advocate for his daughter. He compiled a list of Luna's behaviors, cross-referencing them with the SPD symptoms he had researched. The patterns were undeniable. For the first time since Evelyn's death, he felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to his company, but his quiet revolution was short-lived. The moment Beatrice Croft heard that her brother had scheduled an appointment with a sensory specialist, she descended upon the mansion once again, this time with the righteous fury of a woman whose authority had been challenged. "A sensory specialist," she exclaimed, storming into Julian's study without knocking. She threw her designer handbag onto a chair, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "Julian, have you lost your mind? What nonsense has that maid been filling your head with?" Julian looked up from his notes, his expression calm, a stark contrast to his sister's theatrical outrage. "It's not nonsense, Beatrice. It's a legitimate neurological condition, and her name is Isla." "I don't care what her name is," Beatrice snapped, her voice rising. "She is a servant. You are a Croft. You do not take medical advice from the help. You have the best pediatricians in the state on retainer, and now you're listening to some quack you found on the internet because of a theory from a woman who mops your floors." The disdain in her voice was palpable. To Beatrice, the world was a rigid hierarchy, and her brother's actions were a dangerous violation of that order. She saw his reliance on Isla not as an act of open-mindedness, but as a symptom of his deteriorating mental state. "She understands Luna in a way that no one else has," Julian stated, his voice even but firm. "Oh, please," Beatrice scoffed, pacing the room. "She's manipulating you, Julian. It's a classic case. A vulnerable, grieving man, a pretty young woman who plays the part of the savior. She sees an opportunity, and you are too blinded by your own pain to see it. She'll be asking for a raise next, then a promotion, and before you know it, she'll be picking out new curtains. This has nothing to do with that, and you know it," Julian said, his patience wearing thin. "Doesn't it?" Beatrice stopped pacing and fixed him with a hard, determined stare. "You are not well, Julian. You are making irrational decisions based on the influence of an unqualified employee. You are neglecting your duties at the company, and now you are endangering your own daughter by pursuing these alternative therapies." She took a breath, her voice dropping to a tone that was even more menacing in its feigned concern. "I am your sister, and I will not stand by and watch you fall apart. If you continue down this path, if you give this woman any more authority in this house or in Luna's life, I will have no choice but to intervene." "Intervene how?" Julian asked, a cold dread beginning to form in his stomach. Beatrice's eyes were like chips of ice. "I will petition the court for temporary guardianship of Luna. I will present evidence of your instability, your reliance on unqualified advice, and your failure to provide a stable environment. I will argue that you are an unfit parent. And Julian," she concluded, her voice a silken threat, "I will win." The threat hung in the air, a declaration of war. She wasn't just questioning his judgment anymore. She was threatening to take his daughter away from him. She was weaponizing his grief against him, using his love for Luna as the very tool to sever their connection. The counterattack had been launched, not from an outside enemy, but from within his own family. Dr. Anya Aris was not what Julian had expected. When she arrived at the mansion the following afternoon, there was no air of clinical detachment or academic superiority about her. She was a woman in her late 50s with warm, intelligent eyes, a cascade of silver-streaked hair, and a calming presence that seemed to lower the ambient noise of the room just by entering it. She greeted Julian with a firm handshake and a gentle, knowing smile. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you for calling." It takes a great deal of courage for a parent to look beyond a conventional diagnosis. As she spoke, Isla entered the room, carrying a tray with a glass of water for the doctor. "Doctor." Aris's eyes widened slightly in recognition, a flicker of surprise and pleasure crossing her face. "Isla May," she said, her smile broadening. "I thought that was you. It's been years." Julian and Beatrice, who had insisted on being present for the consultation, both turned to look at Isla, stunned. Isla, for her part, looked equally surprised. "Dr. Aris, I didn't know it was you they had called." "How do you two know each other?" Julian asked, his voice laced with curiosity. Isla was the most insightful participant in a community workshop I ran on nonverbal cues in special needs children about 5 years ago. "Dr. Aris explained, her gaze warm with respect as she looked at Isla. She didn't have the clinical vocabulary, but her intuitive understanding of sensory integration was more advanced than most of my graduate students. I told her then she had a gift. She then turned back to Julian. "I see she's finally found a place where it's being recognized." Beatrice, who had been observing this exchange with a look of sour disbelief, cleared her throat impatiently. "Doctor, while this is all very touching, we are here to discuss my niece's very real medical issues, not the hidden talents of the staff." Dr. Aris's warm smile did not falter, but a new, steely resolve entered her eyes. "On the contrary, Mrs. Croft," she said, turning her full attention to Beatrice. "Understanding the talents of the people who provide primary care is central to a child's well-being." The consultation that followed was a masterclass in compassionate expertise. Dr. Aris did not begin by examining Luna. She began by observing her environment. She walked through the nursery, her fingers trailing over the different textures. She listened to the hum of the air conditioning. She watched the way the light played on the walls. Then, she sat on the floor with Julian and Isla and simply watched Luna. She noted how the baby would startle at the sound of a distant phone ringing, how she would calm instantly when Isla wrapped her in a specific, weighted blanket, and how she would avert her eyes from a brightly colored toy, preferring instead to run her tiny fingers over the smooth, cool surface of a wooden block. After nearly an hour of quiet observation, she finally turned to Julian. "Your initial assessment was correct, Mr. Croft. Luna is presenting with classic, significant signs of sensory processing disorder. She is not a sad baby, she is a neurologically overwhelmed baby." She then looked directly at Beatrice, her tone gentle but firm. "The greatest risk to this child right now is not a lack of traditional medical care. It is a lack of understanding. The work Isla has been doing intuitively creating a low-stimulus environment, using deep pressure. Providing predictable routines is not just babysitting. It is the front line of therapeutic care for a child with this condition." In that moment, Dr. Aris became more than just a medical expert. She became Julian's most powerful and unexpected ally. She provided the irrefutable, professional validation that he desperately needed. Her words were a shield against Beatrice's attacks, a scientific confirmation of Isla's quiet wisdom. She was the bridge between Julian's newfound intuition and the world of evidence-based medicine. and her presence in that room completely disarmed Beatrice's primary weapon, the accusation that he was acting on the foolish, unqualified advice of a maid. Dr. Aris's validation was a turning point. It armed Julian with the one thing Beatrice couldn't dismiss: scientific fact. But he knew his sister. Beatrice was a bulldog. She would not be deterred by a single expert opinion. She would frame it as one doctor's unconventional theory against the consensus of a team of established pediatricians. Her threat to petition for guardianship still loomed, a dark cloud over the fragile progress he had made. She won't stop, Julian told Isla later that evening, as they sat in the now quiet living room. She'll just find another angle of attack. She'll paint Dr. Aris as a fringe practitioner and me as a desperate father grasping at straws. She needs to be shown, not just told. He knew that the final battle would not be won in a doctor's office, but in a courtroom, or at least in the cold, unforgiving arena of a lawyer's office. Beatrice, true to her word, had her attorney schedule a formal family meeting for the end of the week. The stated purpose was to discuss Luna's ongoing care plan and establish a stable framework for her future. Julian knew it was a preliminary hearing for a custody battle. He was prepared. Dr. Aris had provided him with a detailed written report, citing clinical observations and peer-reviewed studies. He had compiled his own log, documenting Luna's triggers and her positive responses to the new, low-stimulus environment. But he felt he was still missing something. He was missing the final, irrefutable piece of evidence, something that could demonstrate, in a way no document could, that he not only understood his daughter's condition, but was the only person capable of providing the specific comfort she needed. The answer came to him 2 nights before the meeting. He was watching the security camera feed from the nursery on his tablet, a habit he had developed not out of suspicion, but out of a quiet, paternal need to watch his daughter sleep. He saw Luna begin to stir, her small body tensing, her breaths becoming shallow, the prelude to a full-blown crying fit. Before the first whimper could escalate, he saw Isla enter the room. She didn't turn on the lights. She moved in the near darkness, a familiar, comforting shadow. She didn't pick Luna up. Instead, she leaned over the crib and began to hum, a deep, resonant, almost guttural sound. It wasn't a lullaby. It was a single, continuous tone. As she hummed, she placed a firm, steady hand on Luna's back. Julian watched, mesmerized, as the tension visibly drained from his daughter's body. Her breathing deepened, her limbs relaxed, and she sank back into a deep, peaceful sleep. The entire episode lasted less than 2 minutes. He rewound the footage, his tech-oriented mind kicking into gear. He isolated the audio of Isla's humming and ran it through a frequency analysis program on his computer. The result appeared on his screen, a low, consistent wave pattern. He cross-referenced it with Dr. Aris's research. It was a perfect match for a technique known as auditory resonance therapy, using specific, low-frequency sounds to calm an overstimulated nervous system. Then, he did the same for the video feed. He analyzed the pressure and duration of Isla's touch on Luna's back. Again, the data aligned perfectly with the principles of deep pressure therapy, a cornerstone of SPD treatment. Isla wasn't just humming. She wasn't just patting the baby's back. She was applying advanced, non-verbal therapeutic techniques with an instinctual precision that was breathtaking. This was his smoking gun. It wasn't a document. It wasn't a doctor's report. It was Luna herself. Her own body, her own nervous system, was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. And Julian knew exactly how he was going to present it. He called Isla into his study. "Isla," he said, his voice charged with a new, unshakable confidence. "At the meeting on Friday, I need you to bring Luna into the room, and I need you to trust me completely." The conference room at Beatrice's law firm was designed to intimidate. Dark wood, a long, imposing table, and a view of the city that seemed to judge all who entered. Beatrice sat at one end, flanked by her stern-faced lawyer and a pediatric nurse Julian recognized from the team he had dismissed. They were the picture of concerned, authoritative intervention. Julian sat opposite them, with Dr. Aris by his side. He appeared calm, his hands resting on a single, slim folder, a stark contrast to the thick binders of evidence piled in front of Beatrice's team. "Julian, we are here," Beatrice began, her tone dripping with condescending pity, "because we are deeply concerned. Luna's well-being is our only priority, and your recent actions have demonstrated a clear and alarming lack of stable judgment. For the next 20 minutes, she and her lawyer laid out their case. They spoke of his unhealthy reliance on an unqualified domestic employee. They presented a report from the fired nurse detailing Luna's unpredictable and difficult temperament. They framed his research into SPD not as diligent parenting, but as a dangerous obsession with fringe internet theories. It was a carefully constructed narrative designed to paint him as an unstable man unraveling under the weight of grief. Julian listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When they had finished, he simply said, "Thank you for sharing your concerns. I believe, however, that you have fundamentally misunderstood the situation." He then nodded toward the door. A moment later, it opened, and Isla May entered. She was not dressed in her uniform, but in a simple professional dress. In her arms, she held Luna, who was awake, calm, and quietly observing the room with wide, curious eyes. Beatrice stiffened. "What is the meaning of this? A child has no place in a legal meeting." "On the contrary," Julian said, his voice now taking on a quiet command. "She is the only one who matters." He then looked at Isla and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Isla, understanding her cue, walked calmly to the far side of the room, near a large window. As she did, she deliberately stumbled, knocking a heavy, leather-bound law book off a side table. The book hit the hardwood floor with a loud, sharp crack. The effect on Luna was instantaneous and devastating. The sudden, unexpected noise shattered the room's calm. Her tiny body went rigid, her face contorted, and she let out a piercing, panicked scream that was pure, unfiltered terror. It wasn't a cry for attention. It was the sound of a nervous system in agonizing overload. "You see," Beatrice said, rising slightly from her chair, a look of grim vindication on her face. "The child is unstable. She needs professional." But Julian held up a hand, silencing her. "Watch," he commanded. The nurse from Beatrice's team rushed forward, arms outstretched. "Let me take her. She just needs to be..." "No," Julian said, his voice stopping her in her tracks. He then rose and walked toward his screaming daughter. He didn't rush. He moved with a slow, deliberate calm. He didn't speak in a high, soothing tone. He began the same low, resonant hum Isla had taught him. He gently drew the curtains on the window, softening the harsh afternoon light. He then reached for his daughter. He didn't scoop her up. He gathered her into his arms, applying a firm, steady, and encompassing pressure, wrapping her securely against his chest. He began to rock, not in a frantic, jiggling motion, but in a slow, deep, rhythmic sway, his humming a constant, grounding vibration. The entire room watched, mesmerized. The change was not immediate, but it was undeniable. Luna's frantic screams began to subside, her rigid body slowly melting against her father's chest. The high-pitched terror in her cries softened to hiccuping sobs, and then to quiet, shuddering breaths. She turned her face into the crook of his neck, her tiny hand gripping his shirt. Within minutes, she was calm, her breathing evening out, her body completely relaxed in the safe harbor of his arms. Julian stood there, rocking his daughter, the only sound in the room their shared, quiet breaths. He then looked directly at his sister, his eyes clear and full of a power she had never seen in him before. "That," he said, his voice low and steady, "is not instability. That is understanding. That is what my daughter needs. Not a team of professionals who don't listen, but a father who has finally learned her language." The final piece of evidence had been presented, and it was irrefutable. The demonstration was a masterstroke. It had transcended legal arguments and medical jargon, presenting a truth so visceral and self-evident that it left no room for debate. The silence that followed was not one of shock, but of dawning, undeniable comprehension. Beatrice Croft sat frozen in her chair, her face a canvas of disbelief and thwarted ambition. The carefully constructed narrative she had built of an unstable brother and a difficult child had been dismantled in under 5 minutes by the very subjects of her condescending pity. Her lawyer was the first to recover, shuffling his papers with a quiet, defeated air. He leaned over and whispered something in her ear, the words inaudible, but the meaning clear. "It's over. We've lost." Dr. Aris, who had watched the entire exchange with a calm, knowing expression, finally spoke. "What you have just witnessed, Mrs. Croft," she said, her voice clear and clinical, "is a textbook example of co-regulation in a child with severe sensory hypersensitivity. It is not something that can be faked or taught from a book. It is a bond built on profound trust and attunement." She then looked at the dismissed nurse, a bond that, "I must say, your report failed to either recognize or foster." The nurse flushed, looking down at her hands, her professional credibility shattered. Beatrice, for the first time in her life, was utterly speechless. Her power, derived from her wealth, her social standing, and her aggressive certainty, had always been her shield, but in the face of her brother's quiet, competent love for his daughter, her weapons were useless. She had come to the meeting armed for a legal battle, but Julian had responded with a demonstration of pure, undeniable fatherhood. The justice in this room was not the kind delivered by a gavel. It was the quiet, resounding justice of the truth being seen. It was the collapse of a false narrative under the simple, unassailable weight of reality. Julian, still holding the now peaceful Luna, looked at his sister, and for the first time he felt not anger, but a deep, weary sadness. "I don't want to fight you, Beatrice," he said, his voice devoid of triumph. "I just want you to see her, not the problem you think she is." He then laid down his terms, not as a victor, but as a father protecting his child. "You will drop this petition. You will not interfere with her care. Dr. Aris will be her primary consultant, and Isla will be an integral part of her therapeutic team. You are welcome in our lives as her aunt, but you will come with respect, or you will not come at all." Beatrice stared at him, her face a mixture of fury and humiliation. She rose stiffly from her chair, her composure a brittle facade. Without another word, she turned and swept out of the room, her lawyer trailing in her wake like a shadow. She hadn't conceded, but her retreat was a surrender in itself. In the quiet aftermath, Julian looked at Isla, who had been standing silently by the door, a guardian angel who had guided him to this moment. The gratitude he felt was too immense for words. He had started this journey to fix his daughter, but in the process, he had found something he thought was lost forever, the man he was supposed to be, the father Luna deserved. The battle was over, and the silent, patient hero who had shown him the way was finally, fully seen. In the weeks and months that followed the showdown in the lawyer's office, the Croft mansion underwent a quiet metamorphosis. The cold, museum-like stillness was gradually replaced by the gentle hum of a home finding its rhythm. Beatrice, true to her defeat, kept a resentful distance, her influence fading from a roar to a whisper, and finally to a welcome silence. The team of detached, clinical professionals was gone, replaced by a new, integrated approach to Luna's care, with Dr. Aris providing guidance and Isla May acting as the compassionate, intuitive heart of the operation. The changes were most visible in the house itself. Julian, guided by Isla's insights and Dr. Aris's recommendations, began to redesign their world to fit Luna, instead of forcing Luna to fit their world. Harsh overhead lights were replaced with soft, dimmable lamps. Sound-dampening panels, artfully disguised as textured wall hangings, were installed in the main living areas. A sensory sanctuary was created in what was once a formal sitting room, now filled with weighted blankets, soft swings, and bins of smooth stones and cool, kinetic sand. The house, once a monument to grief, was becoming a haven of healing. The most profound change, however, was in Julian. He began to shed the armor of the ruthless tech billionaire. He delegated more at Croft Dynamics, leaving the office at 5 o'clock, a practice unheard of before. He learned to read Luna's subtle cues, to anticipate her needs, to become a student of her silent language. He discovered the simple, grounding joy of sitting on the floor, building a tower of blocks, his daughter's laughter the only metric of success that mattered. But he knew this transformation was not his alone. He owed it all to Isla, and he knew that her current role, a strange, undefined mix of maid, nanny, and intuitive therapist was an insult to her true worth. One evening, as they sat on the patio watching the sunset paint the Pacific in hues of rose and gold, Luna sleeping peacefully inside, Julian turned to her. "Ela," he began, his voice serious, "I want to formalize your role here, not as an employee, but as a partner in Luna's care. I want you to have the title, the salary, and the authority that reflects what you truly are: a specialist, an expert." He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a contract, drafted by a new, more compassionate law firm. It outlined a position, Director of Child Development and Sensory Integration for the Croft household. The salary was well into the 6 figures. Isla looked at the contract, then back at him, her expression unreadable. "This is generous." "Julian, it's not generous," he corrected. "It's what you've earned. It's the market rate for a consultant with your proven results." But he wasn't finished. He slid a second folder across the table. "This," he said, his voice filled with a new, quiet excitement, "is the bigger picture." The folder contained the preliminary charter for a new non-profit organization. The name on the top of the page was the Julian Croft Foundation for Sensory Awareness. "My wife, Evelyn, always believed that technology should serve humanity, not the other way around," Julian explained, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to create a foundation in her name, a foundation that will fund research into SPD, provide resources and support for families who can't afford specialists, and advocate for more inclusive, sensory-friendly environments in schools and public spaces." He looked at her, his eyes full of a sincere, humbling request. "I can provide the money, Isla, but I don't have the vision. I don't have the heart. You do. I want you to run it as its executive director. I want you to take everything you know, everything you've learned, and give it to the world." The offer hung in the air, vast and life-altering. It was more than a job. It was a mission. It was a chance to transform her quiet, intuitive wisdom into a force for global change. Julian Croft wasn't just offering her a new title or a bigger salary. He was, in a moment of shocking, transformative clarity, offering her a platform to fulfill her true purpose. He was giving her the power to ensure that no other child and no other parent would have to suffer in the dark, misunderstood silence that had almost consumed his own family. The launch of the Julian Croft Foundation was not a lavish, press-filled gala, but a quiet, heartfelt gathering in the main hall of the Carmel Community Center. The attendees were not billionaires and socialites, but parents, teachers, therapists, and children, the very people the foundation was created to serve. The air buzzed with a sense of shared purpose and profound, grateful hope. Isla May stood at the podium, not as a former maid, but as the Foundation's founding executive director. She wore a simple, elegant dress, but her true adornment was the quiet, unshakable confidence that now radiated from her. She spoke not in corporate jargon, but from the heart, sharing her own story and her vision for a world that was more accommodating to its most sensitive souls. "For too long," she concluded, her warm gaze sweeping across the faces in the crowd, "we have asked children to adapt to a world that was not built for them. It is time we started building a world that is. Julian Croft sat in the front row, a spectator in the best sense of the word. He was not the powerful benefactor seeking applause. He was simply a father, watching with quiet pride. Beside him, Luna, now a thriving, happy toddler, sat in Dr. Aris's lap, calmly stringing large wooden beads onto a piece of yarn, a picture of focused contentment. He had brought her here not as a showpiece, but because this, a community of understanding and acceptance, was her world now. After the ceremony, a young mother approached Isla, her eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was alone," she whispered, clutching a pamphlet on SPD. "I thought my son was just broken. Thank you." Isla simply took her hand, a gesture of shared understanding that was more powerful than any speech. In the years that followed, the foundation flourished under Isla's leadership. It became a beacon of hope for families across the country, funding groundbreaking research, developing sensory-friendly educational tools, and creating a powerful community of support. Isla May, the woman no one had seen, became one of the most respected voices in pediatric wellness. Julian found a new purpose, not as a ruthless CEO, but as a dedicated philanthropist and, most importantly, as a father. He and Isla became partners in a mission that transcended the walls of the Carmel mansion. Their relationship was one built not on romance, but on something deeper and more enduring, a shared commitment to healing, a profound mutual respect, and an unspoken, unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of Luna's journey. The legacy they built was not one of cold, hard technology or corporate dominance. It was a legacy of compassion. It was the sound of a child's laughter in a classroom with softened lights. It was the relief in a parent's eyes when they finally found an answer. It was the quiet, revolutionary idea that the best way to heal a broken world is to first listen to its most sensitive voices. And on quiet evenings, Julian would sometimes walk into Luna's room to find Isla sitting on the floor beside the crib, just as he had that first fateful night. But she was no longer there out of a desperate, lonely necessity. She was there because it was where she belonged. She was home, and in the peaceful, sleeping breath of the little girl who had brought them all together, they had found not just a cause, but a family redefined, not by blood, but by the quiet, resilient, and extraordinary power of understanding.